For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. The Rewilding podcast is made possible through financial support from patrons. Please consider becoming a patron by following the link in the show notes. You can also help by sharing this episode on social media and writing a review on Apple Podcasts. Nearly 1 year ago, I recorded this interview with Lise Silva Gomes, but due to some issues in my personal life, wasn't able to edit and release it until now. Lise is an artist who works with fiber, knots, paint, and more, who has spent a great deal of time thinking and teaching about community-grounded art practice. A huge aspect of rewilding is the practice of ancestral skills, learning to use your hands to create the technologies that we need to live, from the elements of nature that grow and dwell near us. I came to Lizzie's work when searching out ethics, etiquette, and boundaries around communities of artists and creatives. Lizzie is an innovator in this field and has created some amazing resources around this topic that I'm excited to share with you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for asking me.
I first saw your craft and practice meditations on creativity and ethics zine from my friend Betania, the broom maker. They were coming back from Spirit Weavers, and we had been talking about creative property and intellectual property in regards to both craft and writing for quite a while, because they teach things and I teach, we both teach craft. I'm a basket weaver. So yeah, we just saw it, and it answered so many questions and put so many great things all in one place that I was like, oh my God, I have to, buy these and sell 100 of them or whatever and hand them out at my classes. So that's when I ordered like 100 from you or whatever,
I really appreciated that too, because I was just starting to put it out there, and to get a big order like that of support meant a lot to me. So
awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was cool too, because it was there was a lot more than the version that I had seen. Betania had this like pocket-sized version. And so this was like so much more in depth with like the fun interactive aspects of it and stuff like that. So yeah, I just really appreciated it. And I've been following you ever since. And I also feel like you've created several more sort of like series that goes along with this. Are you compiling those into a book?
Yeah, I am working on right now an ECourse version that's going to be like small modules of it, something really bite-sized, because I consulted with a friend on like the best format for this, and I was thinking about an e-course because it felt more personal. It definitely feels intimate, and also feels like someone is helping to guide you through a whole process, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think every format has its strengths and weaknesses, right? Something that could potentially be a weakness about the booklet format is just that, sometimes people will just read different sections at different times, and the way I did the booklet lends itself to that. So you're not reading it in one go, right? And so one good thing about an e-course is like you feel like a progression, right? Working you through. But then also a lot of e-courses out there, I don't know if you've ever had this, but I've definitely bought some that were like expensive, rightfully so, because they're maybe like 10 hours or something like that. But then you never finish it, and it becomes almost a burden in your mind of this thing that you're thinking like, I never finish stuff, or, it just feeds into your dialogue of like, I would be better if I had finished that e-course, but then it becomes so like laden with all these negative emotions that you just continue to never pick it up. right? So
Totally.
I'm doing like these little modules that are super accessible price, like $20 or something like that. They're short and very finishable, maybe just like a few hours, and that's it. And then people can get the modules that they want for the sections they really want to do or whatever. So I'm working on that right now. And then I'm also working on making more like a workbook version that feels even more interactive in the booklet and is longer and gets into even more detailed, I guess, like little niche things, and making that more specifically for creative people who have a practice, could be a private practice, or they could be an artist that shows publicly. But there's just so much to, and I'm sure you know this because we all have these conversations within our own friend circles in creative communities, but there's so much to discuss that isn't discussed. It just kind of stays within our little friend circles. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like there's just so much fear of what we might appear to people if we talk about some of these things. There is definitely a level of privilege to having a public creative practice, right? Like having a platform, and to talk about some of the difficult sides of it. I think for some people feels like they are almost ungrateful for having that platform.
Mm.
So I think that's one thing that stops people from taking the conversation public.
Mm-hmm.
Another is just obviously people not wanting to step on toes, because a lot of these things that frustrate us about, you know, unethical creative things that happen in our community, or just with clients or with, colleagues or whatever, they're difficult and they bring
Mm-hmm.
up a lot of issues. I think that it's a very deep conversation that understandably a lot of people are shy to have outside of their friend circle, outside of like a circle of trust.
Totally. Yeah. So when did you like first get into crafts, and was there anything that happened, or what inspired you to get into the ethics around it? And also, why are the ethics important in craft?
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like I've always, you know, done craft stuff. I was lucky as a kid to have been enrolled in a scouts program. So it was like they did show us ancestral crafts and little bite-sized
Oh,
bits
that's
for like,
awesome.
yeah, and that really got me interested from a young age. I think it also gave me an outlet because at home, like some of the supplies can be expensive, and my family didn't really have money to invest in expensive classes or tutors or all the materials that sometimes you need. So to have something like that was really important and really was like an outlet for me, opened my eyes from a young age. And then I really got more into painting and drawing, and was traditionally trained for like a long
Hmm.
time through college. But this was a different time, I guess, because it was like I graduated from high school in 2000, and at that time there was so many financial barriers. There still is, but I mean even more so to making art into any type of career or
Mm-hmm.
taking it further. Right? Because the internet was not a place to show or sell art at all. You had to get a professional photographer to take slides of your work. So that was like super expensive
Mm-hmm.
investment to pay for. Yeah, I just didn't have the financial resources. So I kind of like sidelined that part of my life until about like 2012. It almost felt like more of, well, first off, it was far more accessible to have a public art practice through using the internet when you couldn't get into like spaces that have,
Mm.
gatekeeping things around them,
Totally.
like a gallery or, yeah, like a craft fair or anything like that. So I actually started just to share what I was doing online without thinking it was going to be anything that would be financially supported or like anything people would come to me for in any kind of way. Either for my practice ended up growing into teaching a lot, teaching nodding and things like that. So When I first did it, I wasn't thinking about teaching anyone. I wasn't thinking about selling anything. I was just kind of engaging in what I feel like also was a more playful time with social media. Like
Mm,
Instagram was not as formulaic as it is now. It
mm-hmm.
wasn't monetized as it is now. It wasn't as judgmental of space. So I would just take pictures of like making knotted necklaces and using all these skills that I was getting back into. People started to ask me to make necklaces for them, shop placed an order, and it kind of got the ball rolling in that direction. But um, I would say I then started to get into speaking more on the ethics part because I would just see so many things, I guess, that were really disturbing to me. Um, Either use of my work, use of friends' work for things that was not given permission or was not the intention of the work. Obviously, copying, and that's something that is accelerated to a whole other level due to the internet, social media platforms. Like, it makes it so easy for people to copy
Mm-hmm.
images, and the images are so crisp and so clear now. It's so easy to see all the details too, even for manufacturing, which I've had my work copied by Anthropology and Urban Outfitters. They did order samples from me at first, which is funny because I've had friends who worked in the industry tell me like they didn't even really need the samples. Like with photos now, you can, send that to an expert at a textile factory who could replicate
Wow.
things, yeah, with exact detail. So, um, I would say it was like a culmination of things that brought me to actually talk about the ethical side. And it's tough. Like, I wanted to write the booklet feeling very open ended because I don't want to present myself as an authority, but I do want to present myself as someone who is um, kind of opening and guiding and possibly moderating, in some ways, a conversation on this.
Yeah. Awesome. And I feel like, as an artist and a teacher and a student, like we all are in different ways, it's interesting to see sort of the breadth of ethics in all of those different things. That's one of the things I really appreciate about the booklet is that it's coming at it from all of these different angles. So it's usable for people in all of these different contexts, because I feel like that's a huge part of ethics is context. And so I just really appreciate the way you've laid it out in regard to like these different aspects of, like what is an ethical teacher? What is an ethical student? What is an ethical practice? Just being able to kind of think about it in this complex way really spells it out in a way that I think makes it digestible and understandable. In that regard, it's divided into like four categories. And the first one is boundaries. And so I'm curious if you could, define what you mean by personal and community boundaries, and then why is that the first thing that you start with in this conversation?
Yeah, that right there is a good question too, is like where to start the conversation and why boundaries. I think about that a lot, and I feel like for me, it makes the most sense to start there because a lot of times people will mirror how we treat ourselves and our practice, right? People will pick up on different vibes. Like if someone's really protective about a certain aspect of their practice, a lot of times you can kind of pick up on that. And people will try to kind of like mimic your boundaries with how they're, I don't know if that phrasing makes sense, but I guess mirroring makes more sense. I'm not sure. But like, sometimes when you feel someone's protective or sensitive about a certain area, you tread lightly just because you're picking up on that vibe.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just kind of what I'm referring to. But then there's also instances, and particularly people who really need a hard no. They want a hard no from you, and they're not treading lightly on things. Even if they feel that you're uncomfortable, they will push until you say no. So we really can't rely on other people to always feel out where our boundaries lie for various reasons. We really have to be able to feel confident in articulating, this is what works for me, this is what I like, this is how I treat my practice, this is what does not work for me, this is what will not happen with my practice. This is how other people cannot treat my practice. So boundaries really happens on two sides, right? Like how you are treating and respecting people, and also how you treat and respect your own practice. I feel like being able to articulate and feel confident in where your boundaries are is just so crucial to you both feeling relaxed and confident and focused on your practice, but also to you protecting your practice, right? So it happens internally. There's something that happens within us, I feel like, when we have the confidence to really step into our boundaries. And it doesn't have anything to do with other people on that level, right? It's something to do with ourselves. Like we're protecting ourselves, and then we have this weird back and forth relationship dialogue where we're proud of ourselves for protecting ourselves, and then we sink deeper into being ourselves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I know in meditative practices, it's talked about multiple senses of self, right? Kind of like the watcher, the observer, we have these multitudes within us that are constantly in dialogue. And I feel like, I know I've experienced this, and I feel like I've witnessed this within, or described by friends as well. But when we aren't protecting ourselves and being true to ourselves, it can create a lot of internal frustration and internal strife, disappointment, self-hatred. A lot of negative emotions come up that are reflected back to ourselves in multiple ways, and are ways that will spill out into our art practice, right? So when we're not at ease within ourselves, a lot of times you can see that, feel that in the art practice, or sometimes people will stop their art practices, right? Because I know this is getting very abstract. I'm trying to think of a more tangible way to describe this, but I feel like sometimes when people are being heavily copied, and there are circumstances when they could say, speak directly to someone, could you please take down that image you reposted of my work without permission? Please stop copying me. Different self-protective things that are confirming our boundaries. When the person is not doing that, and they're uncomfortable with how their work is being used by others, they stop their art practice altogether, right? How many times have we heard this or seen this with friends and just other artists in our community, like, oh yeah, I used to do that. I don't do that anymore. Too many people are copying me. And when you ask more questions about it, they never even had a conversation with any of the people who copied. They never spoke about their boundaries. They never told anyone. They didn't even tell their friends maybe that they were being copied. No one knew this. They just kind of internalized it, kept it within them, and it kind of rotted their art practice from within them, right? So harboring all of this negativity and not being strong in our boundaries so destroy us from within. And that so many people focus on like stepping into your boundaries almost as confrontational and negative. They focus on this idea that it's going to destroy relationships, when really it destroys your relationship with yourself when you don't feel confident to step into boundaries.
It makes me think of, I'm definitely one of those people who's not shy to tell people that they're copying me or put up that kind of boundary. I think initially too, with like one of the interesting things about being in the Columbia Basin Basketry Guild is that I learned through being in the guild that it's like a taboo to take a class from somebody and then teach it later without getting their permission, which is something that, I didn't know was a thing, because I'd gone to like ancestral skills gatherings where it was just kind of like a conference and everybody was sharing stuff. And it wasn't like a guild built around a specific craft with culture around that. It was more like somebody who, dropping into a craft community and then leaving and not really realizing there was all this depth to the ethics because they weren't upfront. And so it was interesting joining the guild and then realizing, oh, there's actually like a lot of ethics behind the craft, but it's not really made available to the public, to like a student that's being introduced to these kinds of things. And so as a student within the guild, it was cool to just learn that there were these kinds of boundaries around specifically craft. I mean, it also applies, I think, to intellectual property in regards to like writing and things like that as well.
Well, I was just going to say on that point, I think that that is such a great discussion point that we should encourage teachers to begin the class discussing boundaries and begin the class discussing what aspects they're teaching that might be their own personal innovations that they're sharing with people with, hoping that students understand the boundaries there and not reshare those aspects. But then there's other aspects that are ancestral, that are traditional, that are open to anyone to use, that they do encourage students to take forward and teach other people, or, so I think this just goes back to opening up the conversation on boundaries and taking out all the emotional strife and secrecy behind this and just making it an open conversation. We can't expect people to know where our boundaries are if we can't even articulate them, right? And really being clear with students, because like you said, if you take a class in a new medium, you have no idea how deep it runs, if what's an innovation that you're learning that's specific to a particular person versus what's ancestral, what to do, what not to do. So just beginning a class with that information is so crucial and helpful for the students. And I want to know where your boundaries lie. I don't want to cross your boundaries, right? So I appreciate if you tell me, like, these are my boundaries. And this is how we should think about them, as just sharing information on how we can better support and respect one another.
It makes me think too of like entitlement mentality. And I think about things like, oftentimes I feel when people learn about a concept like anarchy, they think that rules, which state mandated rules, are the same thing as boundaries. Like there's a conflation there. And so oftentimes I think like anarchists in particular get blamed for like, thinking that there's no such thing as intellectual property, or, because property is theft. Like the sort of concepts that get like interwoven around there that complicate the idea of just like being a decent person and understanding that some people want to be respected and that boundaries are a really great way of doing that. And it's not the same thing as like a steadfast law. It has to do with your relationships with people.
Exactly. And your boundaries can change. And we need to let you know, it's like, okay, if for a while I think, oh, sure, anybody can repost my art. You don't have to ask my permission. And then some years later, I think, actually, I really want people to ask my permission if they're going to repost or use my artwork for products or anything like that. Boundaries can change. We change. It's okay. Like, again, just removing all of the emotion from the conversation and just to be able to speak about it, just matter of fact, like, this is how I'm feeling right now. I'll let you know if that changes. But I think that a big part of the negative reaction people have to this conversation is what you said, which is like conflating this with so many other things and not really understanding what it is, right? It's about the individual and the community and the relationship that the individual has within the community, that every individual can kind of, shape their own way of being treated in their own role within the community. But if you're a part of this bigger community, you also have to respect that we have a set of guidelines that define who we are and what we're doing here as a community. And if we don't have that, things just tend to fall apart, right?
Totally.
But that is something like, I guess it's interesting thinking about law as, boundary on some level, that is true, but on another level, they're more static, I guess. It's much harder to change a law. I think on the level of community boundaries, what's great is like they're constantly in flux and we can come together and decide to change things at any point in time. So, and especially with your individual boundaries, that's within your realm of control and you have total agency over that and you can change it and speak on it at any time you want.
Yeah. Awesome. It's kind of a funny question, but do you have like a checklist in your head of like the top, tiers of what you consider to be the ethics in these things? Like, is there, like permission, for example, might be one of them, or, you know, I don't know. I'm thinking about like all of the complexity of ethics, and they're all kind of interwoven in different ways. But like when you're teaching, do you have like a checklist of things you want to cover in regard to ethics and boundaries?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, when I'm teaching, I do give out something in my class that is like an actual piece of paper that lists my boundaries. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that's kind of funny for people. It was weird to step into it because it almost feels like paperwork or something weird, but it's just something that I think is super basic and really common sense, but it's really shocking how so many people don't see it that way. So I guess because of that, and for the sake of clarity and people taking information in different ways, it does make sense to just present people with it in writing. But the boundaries that I present are in relation to what makes my work unique from the world of knotting, right? Because the classes I teach are about knots and in the context of fiber arts, particularly in combining different elements of fiber arts together to make wall hangings and jewelry and things like that. And there's a lot that can be, I think when people are first accused of copying, it's really funny the way people suddenly want to get super philosophical, like, what is art though?
Oh
And
my God.
what
Yes.
like it's one of the
Mm-hmm.
textbook responses that people who are copying do. It's like suddenly getting super, like wow, it's just like nothing is new under the sun. What even is art? Like who even are you? Like
Oh
who am
God.
I?
Right.
I don't even know who I am. I'm just a
Mm.
being of vibration. It's just like, okay. but, but when I write these boundaries down on a piece of paper, I really try to make it as super simple and boiled down as possible to if someone could tell that something you're making to sell or to teach outside of this class is in relation to my work, then you're out of bounds,
Mm-hmm.
right there. Because we all have our own signatures to things. And if someone can specifically in the whole world of not, there's so many people who do not nodding out there. I mean, just around the world throughout time. But if you're doing something and you took my class and people can specifically say that looks like Lizzie's work, then you haven't found your voice yet, right? And again, to take the emotion out of it, it really is not just for me, it's for that person. You shouldn't want to present things that are not your voice, right?
Right.
Like, you should want to find your voice. And if someone is saying that, like, hey, your work looks like someone else's, that probably means you need to get back on the journey of privately trying to discover what is your voice within these mediums. What are you trying to say? What is your message? What is your aesthetic? What is your signature within this medium? And that takes time and it takes work. And it doesn't happen overnight, and it usually doesn't happen publicly either. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's not something that usually happens before people's eyes on social media. It's usually something that is a lot of hours you're spending alone with your art practice, diving deeper, thinking about what aesthetically resonates with you, what resonates with your journey, like who you are, what you're bringing to the table. And if you don't have something to communicate within the field of this medium and this work that hasn't been really clearly already communicated by someone else, then maybe you don't need to show it publicly. Maybe it could just be your private practice that you do for yourself, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because I do believe like you have to believe and you have to really feel grounded in the fact that you're in touch with something that is your twist, your signature, your unique journey, your unique message. Otherwise, what we have and what we do have in the world is a lot of repetition, a lot of noise that is like really kind of taking up space that doesn't need to be, it's a hard conversation because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the person to judge whether your art practice is relevant or whether it's like unique to you, or I'm really trying to bring this conversation to people to have the dialogue within themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Really, what do you think? Do you think that your art practice and the things that you make are really resonating with something deep and something um, unique within you? Because we all should have a creative practice. I think it's very healing, but we need to really be cognizant of why and how we're showing our work publicly and what that means for our community and for ourselves, right?
Yeah, totally. One of the things that I do, one of the thought processes that I have that's constantly questioning is I teach basket weaving with invasive species. And a lot of that has been experimentation and innovation on my part. While I'm using ancient techniques, the idea of how to process the fiber and the material in order to weave with it has largely been an experiment that I've done, right? And then how to best apply that to basket making techniques is also something that I've done, to the point where the only baskets that I know that are woven with these particular species that are the strongest are the techniques and principles that I've done, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
when I'm teaching, there's this other thing that, for me, I want people to be weaving more with invasive species, because there's this whole ethic there of like removing them, restoring habitat for native plants, having a new relationship to an invasive species. So you're connecting to a plant that's like ostracized, but also removing it. There's like this layering of things that are going on there. And so there's this thing where like I want people to take it away and continue doing it. But at the same time, there's like a need for recognition and, permission with my practice. And so that's one of the things that I ask for when people go and teach what I do, is to like just say, hey, I learned this from Peter. But then you get into this sort of meta thing where like, so they go and teach it to somebody, and then that person teaches it to somebody and that person. And then eventually people are like, oh, I know this person who weaves with invasive species. Have you met them, Peter? And I'm like, I don't know. And then it like links back and somehow they like, learned it through my lineage or whatever, but they have no idea. And so there's this
Right.
thing that's like, and for whatever reason, I was trying to like put the pin on what that emotion is for me. I think there's some sort of like betrayal feeling there, like a community collective. But at the same time, there's this problem because I do want these ideas to go and be beyond me. I do want more people experimenting with these things and figuring them out. And so there's just this constant sort of like, contradiction that goes on in regard to my boundaries, where I don't think they'll ever really end up being I don't know. It's just a constant conflict, I
Yeah.
guess. And I think that for me, it's one of the reasons why I like that you're presenting these conversations, because even if it's just going to always be a conflict, at least if we're having this conversation, then it's always going to be something that we're talking about together and in conflict together.
Yeah, I think you bring up some really good points. One is the one that is really central to the idea of what is your artistic signature, right? It can be as small as a new way to process or manipulate materials. That is enough to be a twist, an innovation. Like sometimes when we get into these discussions about copying or whatnot, people again broaden the discussion to these huge philosophical issues to skirt the point by saying, nothing is new under the sun is something that they say all the time.
Right.
And the thing is, what we're talking about here is building onto an existing legacy that is, so deep and runs how many thousands, if not millions of years
Mm-hmm.
of humanity developing things, that what we're doing at this point, for the most part, is putting a twist on something. And it could be something very simple, but it's just a novel idea no one ever considered. Or it could be a really in depth, really complicated manipulation of something it doesn't matter. It's still a twist, right? Even if it's minimalist art and someone is doing something incredibly minimalist, the first thing that people want to say is my 2-year-old could do that, but your 2-year-old didn't do that. This person did that, so this is their twist. If no one's seen this before, and this is traceable and very identifiable to a particular person, then that's their signature, that's their twist. So, I think part of combating this kind of fruitless dialogue with copiers is just taking this broad conversation they seem to want to have down to, let's keep it simple. This is identifiable to Peter. This is Peter's twist on this thing. And that's all you need to know. And if all you have to do is, when you pass it on, credit Peter with this thing, why does that bother you? Why does that that doesn't take anything away from you. That doesn't stop your ability to share it. In fact, it increases community to have credit, I feel. Because when everyone feels credited, everyone feels great about it. And I want to share more when people credit me more. I want to give more stuff away for free when people credit me. It's funny because people who are, I guess, detractors or like really want to push back on this conversation tend to claim this is about ego, when actually it is about increasing the resources for everyone, because it's about respecting people. I've seen so many artists who are so talented and who used to teach no longer teach anymore, just for the simple reason. And the loss is actually huge, but it's incalculable, because we don't know what would happen if everyone felt credited and celebrated for the twist that they put on things. We could have a far richer creative community than what we have, and there would be far more sharing and free stuff going on. But people pull back. That's the irony of this push and pull dynamic, right? It's like people want to claim, put everything out there, remove your ego, quote unquote, and just don't get any credit. But you will inevitably feel, if you're giving of something and not being celebrated or even acknowledged for it, you will eventually burn out. You will eventually pull back. And so that's part of this interplay of, this almost dialectic of oppositions that needs to happen in order to keep things rich and to keep things abundant for everyone.
Totally. I mean, it's interesting to me too, because I think, when I'm teaching, almost always I'm telling stories about my teachers and things that they taught me. And I feel like I have to honor them as a student and a teacher and practitioner. And so, yeah, when you're talking about it's not about ego, it's like, yeah, the whole time I'm teaching, I'm basically like, these are the things that I innovated, but I wouldn't have been able to do that if it hadn't been for, my teachers like Margaret Mathewson and Catherine Lewis and, different basket weavers, Donna Crispin, like I could just list them off. And like, it also, to me, I think about how it increases community, because then you're also giving those people that are students to you resources to another teacher as well, if they're alive, and still teaching. And then you can kind of see this cross-pollination of creativity happening within the communities of creativity, where you just have more minds and people to interact with and see who's teaching what and learn from them in various ways. So it's just interesting to me. So one of my pieces of writing was plagiarized, and it wasn't plagiarism in like direct copy, but plagiarism in the sense of it was like it enough to be seen as basically the same thing with no new twist. But the other thing about it, like you were saying, that you have to add the twist. When I was looking into like the ideas around plagiarism, even if you add a twist to something, if people think that you're the creator of like the entire thing, that's still technically considered plagiarism, because you haven't shown that you didn't invent like the original particular concept or something, right? So again, there's this idea of like citing in literary, when you're writing anyway, you have to cite your sources. Otherwise, people think you created this idea that you're talking about, right? And so it's interesting to think about, like you're saying, add this twist. And then also, I think that idea of honoring my teachers and then recognizing my twist is like a way of role modeling that behavior, even though many of the students don't necessarily take it on. So I think it's a good idea. I might actually end up having a list of boundaries. I like that idea a lot. Right now, all I do is have actually for my philosophy classes, I started doing an NDA that people have to sign. And then what it says is just, please ask for my permission if there's any specific things from the class you are writing about or sharing, to make sure that it isn't just isn't specifically something that I've created, like a visual graphic or something, because I've generated a lot of those things for some of my classes. So we'll see how that goes. It scared some people away, actually. They're like, I saw there was an NDA. I don't know. I write about this too. Does that mean if I sign this, I can't write about it? And I was like, it just means that you have to ask my permission if there's something specific from the class, and then credit me. Those are the two things that I generally want to stick to.
Hmm. I think that's great. And, it's funny because I do feel like a lot of people know that they have a difficulty with, they absorb information and then they instantly want to present it as their own. I think some people have a difficulty separating what is their innovation from what information they're taking in. And of people, friends or whoever who I know this about themselves, they specifically stay away from taking classes from colleagues. They specifically stay away from even, sometimes reading things that they know they're going to be too influenced by. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm saying it's interesting to think about that. I'm sure we've probably all heard someone. I had a friend who was writing a book and just being like, I have to be very, very careful what I read while I'm working on my book, because I have a tendency to put stuff in and it's not even conscious, it can be subconscious. But, this is kind of how we were taught to do things. I don't feel like from an early age we're taught about credit. We're not taught to celebrate each other in that way. We're not taught to acknowledge. We're not taught to cite from a young age. We're told we have to do that later. Like suddenly at college, it really hit. Citations are this new thing, and you have to learn MLA style and all these things that, a lot of kids are not taught anything about, and they don't even know why they're doing it. I don't feel like a lot of like first year, second year college students really know why they're expected to cite, what that is about. One thing I want to bring this conversation to and link it to more tangibly and more clearly is colonization and racism and white supremacy, because I feel like culturally a lot of these things are things that are part of the colonizer culture that we've been taught into, which is, I found it, I like it, I see it, it's mine, and extracting things from anything, extracting things from communities, extracting things from the environment, without any kind of conversation or even thought about consequence, about what we're taking, what it means to take that, and once it's absorbed into some other process for our own purposes, for money or attention or anything else, where that leaves the community or the location we've taken the thing from. So I think that this is kind of all part and parcel of bigger cultural problems that once we have these conversations and can kind of correct in our creative communities, which tend to be more innovative and progressive and also community oriented, right? A lot of times outside the mainstream, that it can influence, it can flow into other communities, and we can, as you say, model some of these things. And so I feel like the importance of this conversation is also about changing our mainstream culture in small ways, starting with our little outsider art communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever heard the term cryptomnesia?
No, I haven't.
It's like, some scientific term for the thing where when somebody hears something and then they forget it, and then months later come up with the idea and think that they've generated it themselves. I first heard about it because I was reading about comedians stealing each other's jokes or not realizing they had done so. And so there was this idea of like, I think it was like Dane Cook or something stealing somebody else's jokes or having this idea of cryptomnesia. And I've even seen it in myself too, like I'm definitely guilty, especially when I was younger, of like taking a class and then immediately teaching those kinds of things. Or like, I took notes at a class once and then a year, 2 years later, I came up with this great idea and I was going back through these notes and then saw that it was something that the teacher had said and I had written down, and I'm like, wow, okay. So, again, thinking about that concept of ego, it makes me think about how much of, and maybe we can shift to talk about like a muse as well, but like how much of what I generate or think I'm generating creatively is also specifically coming from the community or the culture that and context that I situate myself in. And then, going forward for me, sort of thinking about in terms of acknowledging the influences that I've had, not just my teachers that might have taught me something that I forgot, you know what I mean? And so trying to like include all those people and then also recognize that in a sense, my creative process, I think of myself as like a court reporter listening to a courtroom and I'm just typing up what's being said. And it's just like coming through me. It's not really like I'm generating it myself specifically, but then I am the one that's typing out the thing or whatever, right? So in that regard, I can think of myself creatively as more of a compiler, that then it's my particular voice that things are coming through. But yeah, I'm just thinking about like cryptomnesia and that process of sort of understanding that there's all of these sources of information that I've learned from. And in regard to colonialism, especially with ancestral skills, like how many of the skills that we teach today were taught by native people to non-native people and then are now being taught, in these various communities without the credit that's being given back to those communities, that's huge in rewilding, and I think there's starting to be a turn in that. At least particularly there's certain organizations like Rewild Portland that are working to move those things in a different direction than they have been, by the archaeological field that created a lot of the ancestral skills gatherings and things that we see today. But I totally agree with you in that regard. I think that's like a huge component of it.
Yeah, and I think that, that extends into also understanding that this conversation, it's not really about punishing and casting out people. It's really about redirecting our focus to being grounded in the community and having a really intentional practice that seeks to position our voice within a community in a really loving or just respectful way. You touch on so many things. Like I'm thinking about so many different things you kind of like express. There's a lot there. But I think that it's hard to have these conversations without people feeling like this is a conversation that's intent on shaming people or, I think when people hear no or don't, they instantly want to push back against that, in various ways. And one way is just like, you're shaming me, and it's like, that's not what this is. We're not trying to ostracize or cancel or shame anyone. We're trying to really get people on our side, right? Like not on our side in terms of our like an agenda, but on our side meaning within our community. I want to pull people into my community, right? Like I don't want to have enemies or pushing people out that are gonna, you know, want to have some kind of tension with me or my community. I want to pull everyone in so we're working together on this. So saying don't or saying please avoid or saying this is not okay, it's with the intent to call in, right? Instead of call out. But what's interesting is like, especially on my Instagram platform in my stories, like I have a lot of strong language and I am calling people out because for me, there's a ladder of action that needs to happen of escalation for people to hear. So it's like, I first start always with lovingly calling people in. Let's say, for example, in the most extreme example, there is a corporation like Anthropology or Urban. They're not going to respond to a loving call in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you, for some of these people, you really, and this goes back to how entrenched they are into this colonizer aspect of this colonizer culture and their entitlement, is they are not going to take it seriously until it escalates. A good example, there is a friend of mine who is really supportive of, or was really supportive of, an artist who was very blatantly ripping off indigenous aesthetics. This is not someone who is indigenous, and she's built a huge platform on it. She's white, and her work is in a lot of white spaces as a direct ripoff of indigenous work in these spaces that no indigenous artists are ever included in, right?
Right.
And I had told my friend what she's doing is not right. She's ripping off indigenous people, and she's allowed access into the space simply for the fact that she has network connections. She's white, and she can gain access through various ways to these spaces that the people who descend from the ancestors that create this technique cannot enter those spaces. They do not have the cultural capital or anything to get in there. And I told my friend this in a loving way, just like, I just want to let you know that you're really endorsing this person that is really actually doing destructive things with her art practice. And my friend just kind of blew it off and was like, I've known her a long time. She's a nice person. I'm like, I'm sure she's a nice person. However,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what she's doing is very destructive. She didn't listen to me. And a year later, my friend's Instagram is getting trolled really hard by a ton of people who are like, you are complicit with this white supremacy. This is wrong. Da da da. And it really hurt her. And what did she do? But she DM'd me, and she was like, how do I deal with this? And I was like, you know what? I don't know what to say. I had a loving call in with you like a year earlier, and you brushed me off. And now you're getting the hard call out. Like it just kind of happens. She was not prepared to listen to a loving call in. But you better believe when she got the hard call out, she got the message, and she stopped endorsing this person, and she changed her tune, and she stopped defending them. So it's really funny, but I think just different situations call for different things. And I always start this conversation in a loving call-in way, but sometimes with copying, protecting your work or protecting your community's work or protecting a vulnerable community's work, you have to escalate the conversation. Once the conversation is escalated, if someone turns around, I am fully prepared to embrace them back into the community if they can show that they're really doing the work to change their ways and to stop these destructive habits or practices. So for me, it's never about casting people out, even though people are going to see some really harsh, very direct, very blunt language from me toward some of these people in my stories. It's always with the intent that they stop doing destructive or abusive things and come back into the fold, like, and they can be welcomed back into the community.
It just makes me think of what you're asking for in regard to ethics and creativity is just for people to live in reciprocity with one another instead of people stealing from one another. It just comes down to a power dynamic. I mean, that's what it seems like.
Yes. Power is really crucial in just, I feel like, judging a lot of these scenarios, these cases of what's really happening. If someone who holds power is walking away with a really valuable resource from a vulnerable community without credit, without permission, without any financial flow back to that community, that's a problem. And it really does come down to this for me. Like a lot of times people, again, when people want to push back on this, they get really broad, they get really abstract. And honestly, as much as I talk about things like cultural appropriation, the things that are not interesting to me are the things that get into areas where we're really not talking about power and we're really not talking about wealth. Like cultural appropriation for me is really a topic centered on inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And the areas that are two equally powerful cultures, like kind of taking things from each other. It gets into other gray areas. That's a more nuanced conversation than I'm prepared to
Totally.
have at this point.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's like weird state level, massive hierarchies, kind of colliding or something. And it's, yeah. I wrote an essay on cultural appropriation in Rewilding years ago. And it's interesting to look at it now because while it holds up in many ways, I think what I was trying to do was recognize exactly what you just said, was that it's about the power differential, and when people often see something that looks like, for example, I posted a picture of some friends once doing archery at an archery range here in Portland, and somebody commented on it on my blog and was like, "Oh, great, white people playing Indian," and I was like, "There's." Okay, that's not, it's an interesting thing. I'm like, what is this person's feeling and response? Like, I'm trying to understand because it's not actually, we're not copying other people because archery is a global thing. But at the same time, like there's an emotion there that's real, that's being triggered by something that's real. And that's when I think I first realized that it wasn't about necessarily the perception of even cultural theft in that instance, but the perception of cultural theft in the sense that whiteness and, the United States has stolen the ability to even engage in that particular type of culture. So it's not that, we were stealing an aspect of culture. It's that we were stealing the ability to enact culture. It's like there's Standing Rock going on where there's these people who are fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, there's like people who are just like hunting with bows and arrows in the forest. It's legal for them. They're not going to get stopped. They're not fighting for their lives. And so where is this line of like, for me, that's where it comes down to. It's not like artifact or object appropriation. It's just literally land theft and culture theft. And then, so I feel like that it like trickles down from that or permeates up from it, and it becomes invisible or confusing to talk about on the surface if you're not going down into that depth of understanding, like where the idea of being unethical like originates from.
Right. Yeah, I think you made a really important point, which is sometimes things like that person's comment wasn't accurate, but it was accurate
Right.
in describing something, right?
Exactly.
And I think that a lot of people, their reaction is to push back and to say, this is a global practice by, people from around the world, or to say, like, as I think a common one would be like, as a white person, you can't do anything anymore. Like these exaggerated kind of
Yes.
things, like people are infringing on
Right.
my ability
Yeah.
to do anything, or when really, I like your response is to listen deeper and to reflect deeper and to think like, okay, well, literally the US government has stopped, indigenous people from being able to practice traditional modes of hunting, sport, whatever. And when indigenous people do that, there's words like primitive, savage, there's a fear around it.
Totally.
And then there's, for those people Black and brown people who actually want to reclaim those ancestral practices, there's no resources for it. They're not invited into the communities. The truth of the matter is that when we post something online, the optics speak to more than our intention. They speak to our positioning within an entire historical context. And I think a lot of times white people are not used to thinking about themselves within the historical context. And when they're reminded of the historical context, the instant reaction is to push back, like, I'm my own person. I don't have anything to do with that. I'm not responsible for this. When Black and brown people are very used to having their entire lives being characterized by other people, particularly white people or just people of any race outside of their community, as
their life is not really their own individuality. It's within a historical context, whether that's related to stereotyping or what people perceive of their background, why they're in the position that they're in today as a result of history rather than their own individuality. So I think that as we get deeper into these conversations, it is important that I think for white people, particularly, practicing things that are ancestral and showing them online, even though optics are considered really superficial, there's a depth that we can get into with how this image can be taken in the historical context, not just an image from our daily life as an individual, right? When people gather in groups, particularly to learn, to practice, to enjoy ancestral traditions, the things that made those spaces possible, particularly for white people, have been colonialism, have been destructive things. So maybe when, as a white person, people want to show images of themselves practicing something ancestral, think about, how can I invite someone outside this community to practice? How can I, for free, teach the skill to a group of kids from a vulnerable population who may be interested? How can I volunteer my services? How can I invite people in? How can I also talk about this ancestral practice in a way that doesn't center myself? Because we can show, and I try to get this point across to a lot of people who are engaging in ancestral crafts. The image you put up showing the ancestral craft that you're so passionate about doesn't have to have you in it. It could just be of the item you're making.
Totally.
It could be of your teacher. It could be of your class. And there's something so destructive about this aspect of social media that centers us within every single image and every single topic that we talk about. And getting used to kind of decentering and being subversive in this way where we're posting pictures or we're talking about things in a way that celebrates other people, celebrates ancestors, and doesn't even include us within it. It could just be sharing the information online without an image of ourselves in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny you say that. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I do a lot of different things, crafting, organizing, podcast, and I keep thinking about that in regard to Instagram, especially because of the things I want to post on there. And then knowing that the algorithm will actually show your picture to more people if you do post your face in there. It's just like,
Ooh.
it's encouraging this kind of weird centering of the person. Anyway.
And that's the thing of why I tell people to, when they're developing a new art practice, don't put it on social media at all, because you're going to get a feedback as you post as you're a student to a new art practice. And you think it's not going to influence you, but it will subconsciously, because these things are specifically orchestrated to keep us addicted, to give us these dopamine bursts, like when we're looking at our likes and people's comments. And we think it's not feeding in, but subconsciously it is. And I'm very cautious. I really want to draw people into this conversation as artists, as creators. How is social media changing our art practice, right? As for the first time in history, we're getting instant feedback on what we're doing. Oh, this post of this new thing I'm working on didn't get as many likes as my old stuff. So maybe I should go back to my old stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Totally. And sometimes I don't
Yeah.
even think it's that conscious. I think it's just like you don't get that dopamine hit when you are posting something, and then maybe you're kind of like, I'm not going to do that thing anymore. I don't like it as much. When really it's like, what are you liking? Are you talking about the process of creating it, or are you talking about the reactions?
Right. Wow. Oh my God. Yeah, I actually just had that happen yesterday, where I was promoting a previous podcast with a photograph, and then it didn't get as many likes as I thought it was going to, and I was really excited about it. And I was like, well, maybe I won't do those.
It's funny, but it's so it's not our this is how this stuff was made by
Right.
experts too. There it's engineered like this.
Yeah.
And just starting to ask questions about it and ask questions for our own internal dialogue, but also when we talk about it with other people, can start the path of like maybe deconstructing some of these things that
Mm-hmm.
change in the future, the way they're being formatted, or will change the way we show art in the future. I don't know. But I just ask people to just be mindful, start asking questions about it. I don't know what the answer is. I use Instagram as much as other people, and there's great aspects to it, but there's also some scary, some scary
Mm-hmm.
aspects of like, how are we unconsciously allowing it to change us, guide us to behaviors we wouldn't have
Totally.
otherwise
Yeah.
went to.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, it makes me think of like the YouTube spirals that have created all of these conspiracy theorists and white supremacists, just because
Yeah.
of the way the algorithm was designed. It's total like accidental mind control, or not even accidental in some ways, but, you know, intentional
Anyone
accidental.
interested, absolutely. And anyone interested in this specifically, I advise to read Jaron Lanier or Lanier, depending on how he pronounces it. But he's like one of the creators of virtual reality, and he's very critical of social media and has really interesting ideas with where it should go. And I love his books, and he has a lot of accessible talks on YouTube about these topics. Basically, his premise is that these platforms were designed with a third party, basically advertisers, as an intermediary in every single conversation we have, because the bots are the algorithms
Mm-hmm.
are like taking note of every DM we write, every comment, everything we do, and then showing us things. So it's this invisible hand that's in this um, what is really a big part of our lives, I would
Mm-hmm.
say, the amount of time people spend across platforms on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, whatever. And basically, when it comes down to it, these platforms are based on manipulation, manipulating us to make certain. They're legitimately centered on behavior modification psychology
Mm-hmm.
and changing us, guiding us toward different pathways. So
So I,
it's interesting. Yeah, I want to get into thinking and talking more about how these things influence our practices.
yeah, it sounds like you're kind of, maybe you've already written a booklet about that, or I saw yesterday on your Instagram recently about like limiting your time on social media as an artist. And is that a class that you're going to be offering soon, or is it a booklet?
Yeah, I'm still shaping it. I'm not sure what it will be yet. I'm having a hard time with social media right now myself because I'm trying to take my own advice and like really dive deep into things before I present them. So
Mm,
I have all of
mm-hmm.
these writings that I've never put out there yet, and I'm still kind of processing. And a lot of times I like to talk through some of the ideas with friends and see how they resonate to like shape them up and make them better before I put them out there. So I hope to have like an e-course specifically on this topic by the end of the summer.
Awesome.
Um, and it's something that I think I needed to work through too
Mm-hmm.
within myself,
Mm-hmm.
just to figure out what am I doing, because I've had some things happen recently where it's just interesting, the format of social media and what it, as you said, like what is encouraged by it. My sister, who used to do a lot of landscape photography, stopped doing it after a few years of posting it on social media. Like she completely stopped her art practice because it really didn't get any much response on social media, because the way her photos were formatted were wide, and on Instagram everything is like either the it has to be
Mm,
like square
mm-hmm.
rectangle to really grab people's attention. If you have a very distant landscape and it's a wide format photo, it's just so small on the
Mm-hmm.
screen, and
Yeah.
unless you're manipulating it a lot with editing techniques, it's just not going to pop on a screen.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that the response in this platform that actually is so cheap. It's based off of like advertising money and
Mm-hmm.
surveillance is actually
Right.
determining people's art practices.
Yeah.
Like breaks my heart to
Yeah.
think about. And I've had recently some people who posted things that, I mean, you know, from my Instagram, sometimes when I'm posting like these informative things on creating a community grounded art practice, they're really long. I put in like tons of writing. I feel like I have to be so complete. And I'll see people who will extract one little tiny aspect and they'll make it a big caption and a big post and it'll blow up. And I've come to realize that people don't want to read that much. It's a very fast-paced medium, and if you can just put one statement that people can feel in that moment that they get behind as they're scrolling, and it's usually very hyperbole or something like that,
Totally.
that is what people respond to.
Right.
So I recently had someone who was kind of like doing a very new to this concept of creative ethics, specifically in the fiber community, and she created an account and she was posting things that were very, very bite-sized, and it just blew up so fast. And I just really had to think about that, like, why is this? Why does this appeal more to people that they can get behind it faster? And I think one thing is just like people are unsure when there's a lot of information you're posting in a one particular post, that maybe they'll save it and say, maybe I'll read it later or something like that. But if they can't instantly get behind it, then it's like something that can get kind of lost at sea, you know,
Totally.
in all
Yeah.
the ocean of all of this
Yeah.
noise.
I mean, it makes me think of just the attention span of social media, even like YouTube. It's all about grabbing people's attention and trying to hold it as long as possible. And so if anybody has to sit there and daydream for a minute about a thought or read through something that's more nuanced than a headline, I mean, it makes me, they realized that people were sharing articles on Facebook, for example, just based on headlines, and people weren't actually reading
Yeah.
them or like seeing them. So now, like even on Twitter, I think I shared an article without clicking the link because I had
Mhm.
already read it. But I clicked share, and I think Twitter had a thing that was like, have you thought about reading this article before you share it or something like that? It was like, and I was like, wow,
Wow.
Twitter's like kind of stepping up their that ideas around that. It makes me think
That's
too of like,
interesting.
even when YouTube was invented long ago, before any of this, well, in the 90s, I had like a film screening in Portland that was like an open mic style film screening. So you would make a short video and then show up, put your name on the form, and then you get to show your video in the order that you were written in or whatever. And there was this video that I made, and it was just a music video to the song Attitude by the Misfits. And it was just like intentionally boring. It's me just like lip syncing the song at the camera for 2.5 minutes. And then at the end of it, the camera flips around at the very last shot, and you see that this whole time I've been like yelling at my cat, who's like sitting there, looking kind of annoyed, like whipping her tail or whatever, not really caring,
Hmm.
just slightly annoyed or whatever. And so the punchline was determined on the audience getting bored. And so
Mm.
once it was uploaded to YouTube, it just looks like, a kid yelling at their camera or whatever for 2.5 minutes. And nobody has the attention span to stay there for the punchline because they're not a captive audience, right? They can just hit the channel surfing button.
Mhm.
And it was that moment where I realized like how that medium was already changing the creation of art to have to be constantly captivating the audience so that they wouldn't channel surf away. Whereas when I was showing it in a theater, the audience couldn't leave. Maybe they could get up and walk away, but it was like they had to actually be there. And so that like sensation of getting annoyed and bored that the video was going on too long was missing from the YouTube video. And so there were just constant, this is stupid, all the comments on the video. And then, finally after like 10 or 20
Mhm.
comments, somebody was like, oh, this is genius. Did anybody stay till the end, And it
Mhm.
just makes me think about that with writing on formats, especially like Instagram, where it's like you were saying, it's just this one phrase that was taken out that blew up.
Yeah, it's tough not being. I think some people naturally have a certain like style and mindset that is so great on social media and really conveys and they feel comfortable with it. And I just don't. I can't get into it. It's just not.
Yeah.
Um, it doesn't resonate with my personal style. And I think obviously there's a lot more sinister stuff going on behind social media, considering like
Sure.
the advertising money and the data collection and the surveillance, and like there's a lot of that. But just looking at the platform on its own, I think that there are some artists and speakers that really effectively utilize this
Totally.
format, and I think their work is great.
Oh, yeah,
I
absolutely.
just yeah, I think it's great. I'm concerned for the people who don't have
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think more people than not, if like that's confusing wording, more people than not don't have anyway, like
Mm-hmm.
triple, quadruple negative. But I think most artists aren't optimized for social
Totally.
media, right? And so that's what I'm concerned about. I was
Mm-hmm.
even listening to a podcast. I want to say it was 99% Invisible that was talking about how um, minimalism and bold motifs in architecture, basically that Instagram was changing the architecture field because what pops on social media are bold colors, uh, very minimal shapes. There's just a certain formula that people have figured out that gets the most likes, right? That gets the most
Totally.
engagement. And because people are looking at art so much through a screen, it really is changing a lot of these fields and who is being highlighted, which artist's work is being valued. And I really hope that as communities we can create platforms like you're saying with the theater. That is such an important platform that I hope never dies, of screening films and having community gatherings, because there is such a strength to community reaction, watching something together. There's a strength to having that captive audience thing. There's a strength to curated content where people know, okay, this film may seem strange at first, but hang in there because this person who is curating the lineup for this film showing like has great taste, and I
Mm-hmm.
trust that we're all here watching this because it does have values. So let's hang in and sit with it and be slow with this film because the payoff is going to be good. It's going to be worth it, and that's why we need these other community ecosystems, infrastructures outside of these corporate infrastructures like Instagram, which are dominating the way that we practice art, the way we communicate as artists, the way we show art. And we really need to be thinking more locally within our communities of like, how can we create valued systems and platforms that are off of these corporate platforms?
Totally. Yeah. Well, I've got you here for an hour and a half now, so I feel like I should probably let you go. I'm looking forward to any new thing that you put out, especially the online stuff. I'm excited that you're going to be offering classes. I would love to take your social media one once you get it dialed in. And yeah, just thank you for coming on. And I hope to, engage with you again on here in the future.
I really appreciate your support, and it was a great conversation. And actually, it was very refreshing to even have this dialogue because, during quarantine, I feel like we need these spaces like podcasts and things to be able
Oh,
to
yeah.
hear and communicate with people in our community. So thank you for doing this.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome. To follow Lizzie on social media and support her work, check out the links in the podcast notes. If this episode spoke to you, make sure to share it on social media. And if you want the podcast to continue, consider becoming a patron. Thanks for listening.